A Ming or not a Ming? Dot and Brian arrived home from the local car boot sale. Brian sits in the lounge looking at his laptop, while Dot takes the dog out for a walk. Standing on the coffee table is an attractive Chinese-looking vase, an item they bought this morning at the car boot sale. They feel it could be of some value, so Brian is researching it on the internet. Dot returns home from walking the dog. "Brian," she calls out, "I've just met our new neighbour. He was out walking his dog Barney. His name is James, he's 42 and a bachelor." "It hasn't taken you long to find so much about him," said Brian. "He's only been here a few days." "Well," said Dot, "I've invited him around tonight about 6 o'clock, so I'm popping out to the shops to get more wine and some nibbles." "Tonight?" said Brian. "Why didn't you discuss this with me first? You know I feel uncomfortable with strangers." "You'll be fine," said Dot, as she sets off to the shops. "I'll try and be as quick as I can, just in case he comes early." Brian, not happy with the arrangement, pours himself a glass of wine and starts reading the paper. Suddenly there's a knock at the door. "I wonder who that is," said Brian, as he gets up to answer it. "Hi," said the visitor, holding a leaflet in his hand. "My name is James, and I'm just..." But before he could say any more, Brian interrupts him. "Hello, James. I'm Brian, pleased to meet you. Come in, we weren't expecting you till later. Dot will be home shortly, she's just gone to the shop." James, a little puzzled, enters the house and follows Brian into the lounge. "Take a seat, James," said Brian. "Don't worry about the dog, she's friendly enough. Not much of a guard dog, but good company. Can I get you a drink?" "Just a glass of water, please," said James. James notices the attractive-looking vase on the coffee table. He picks it up and shows quite an interest in it. Brian walks in and passes James the glass of water. "I see you are looking at that vase," said Brian. "We got it from the car boot sale this morning. I've looked it up on Google and it resembles a Ming. But it can't be. We only paid a $5 for it. We are hoping to get it valued tomorrow, then we'll know for sure." As James replaces the vase on the table, he knocks over his glass of water. "Oh dear, sorry about that," he says. "I'm so clumsy." "Don't worry," said Brian. "These things happen. I'll just go and get a cloth." As Brian leaves the room, James picks up the vase again. He has a sneaky suspicion that it could be of some value. Brian returns with the cloth. "You are showing some interest in the vase," said Brian. "Yes," said James. "I know a bit about pottery. I can't see any identification marks to show that this is a Ming." "Ah well," said Brian, "we will get to know tomorrow, one way or the other." Brian, who is not very good at conversing with strangers, was just about to get into some kind of conversation when the phone rings in the hall. "Excuse me," said Brian, a little relieved. "I'll just go and see who that is." "Take your time," said James. "If you don't mind, I'll just pop outside and have a cigarette. Bad habits and all that." Brian returns to the lounge, muttering to himself, "Another nuisance call, I'm sick of them." Realising James is still outside, he sits down with a glass of wine and continues reading the newspaper. Dot returns with the shopping. "Brian," she calls out, "I've just seen James in the supermarket. He's looking forward to coming round tonight. about 6 o'clock as planned." "That's odd," said Brian. "We already have a visitor called James. I presume he is our neighbour. He's outside having a cigarette." "I didn't notice anyone outside," said Dot. She spots Brian's empty wine glass. "Perhaps you nodded off to sleep and it was all a dream. I do think you should cut down on the wine in the afternoon." "It's nothing to do with the wine," said Brian. "And no, I did not fall asleep. Someone called James, who I thought was our new neighbour, was in our house. And while I was answering the phone, he went outside for a cigarette." "Well, he's not there now," said Dot, putting away the shopping. "So who could it have been?" said Brian. "I can't believe I've invited a complete stranger into our house." "Well, looks as if you did," said Dot. "So try to be more careful in future." Dot sits down in the lounge and starts stroking the dog. "Where's the vase?" said Dot. "It's not here." "Well, it should be," said Brian. At that moment, they looked at each other and suddenly realised the stranger, called James, has obviously taken it. "Thinking about it," said Brian, "he was showing quite an interest in the vase. He thought it was a nice piece of pottery, but in his opinion wasn't worth much." "Well, he must have thought it was worth something because he's stolen it," said Dot. "Do you think we should call the police?" "I shouldn't bother," said Brian. "By the time they get here, he will be long gone. It's a good job we didn't pay a lot for it." Around 6 o'clock, Dot answers a knock at the door. "Come in, James. Please you could make it. Meet my husband, Brian. He started inviting complete strangers into the house." "What do you mean?" said James. "It's a long story," said Dot. "I will explain over a glass of wine." A few weeks later, Dot and Brian were sat in the lounge. Brian, as usual, was reading the newspaper. Suddenly, he gave out a huge gasp. "Oh no," he said. "I don't believe it." "What on earth is the matter?" said Dot. "Looks like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," said Brian. "A picture of the vase we had stolen." "Are you sure?" said Dot. "I'm absolutely certain," he said. "So what's the problem?" said Dot. "Problem?" said Brian. "The problem is it turned out to be a genuine Ming. It has just been sold at auction, and you will never guess how much for. £5 million. "How much?" said Dot. £5 million, repeated Brian. "Oh no, we might have been millionaires," said Dot, as she promptly passes out on the settee.